Welcome back to another great episode of DSA's Life by Design. I'm your host, Arthur Kade, and we have a very influential and important guest joining us today, Clark Neily, who was formerly with the Institute for Justice. He was the senior attorney and director of IJ's Center for Judicial Engagement, helped battle the interior design cartel for about 10 years in that role, and currently is a senior vice president for legal studies at the Kade Institute. Clark, thank you so much for joining the show.
Pleasure to be with you.
You have done such an incredible amount of work in aiding interior designers in ways that people could never imagine outside of the industry. How did it all begin for you? How did you become aware of what interior designers were dealing with, the obstacles, the roadblocks?
Yeah, so it's been just an incredible journey. I worked for a public interest law firm, so I'm a lawyer, and I worked for a public interest law firm called the Institute for Justice, as you mentioned. And one of the things that the Institute for Justice tries to do is to challenge unreasonable and unconstitutional occupational licensing requirements. So just to speak in really broad terms, I would guess that most people would agree that it's reasonable to require somebody who wants to be a doctor to go to school, to have qualifications, perhaps even to get some form of government approval to do that work. At the other end of the spectrum, there are some occupations that seem so innocuous that it would be very strange to require an occupational license the way we do with doctors and lawyers. An example of that would be, I actually challenged a law in Louisiana where you have to have a license from the government to be a florist. So in my estimation, interior design falls on the part of that spectrum that really there's no strong case for requiring a license. And the work is important, can be very technical. I'm well aware of that. But the fact of the matter is that most states do not require a license to practice interior design, and there have been no problems as a result. And so that tells us that you can do this job without government approval. And that was the nature of my involvement, is trying to push back against efforts to impose a licensing requirement, an unnecessary and unconstitutional licensing requirement on would-be interior designers.
When you realized that interior designers were battling these important obstacles, what was the process for diving in and fighting that battle?
Yeah, well, so I wasn't really even aware that licensing was an issue for interior designers until I forget who it was that brought it to my attention, but this happens very commonly as a public interest lawyer. Somebody will say, hey, you wouldn't believe it, but you have to have a license to do X, Y, or Z. So at the time, the only states that licensed the practice of interior design were Florida, Louisiana, and Nevada. And Florida had by far the worst licensing regime. So I started looking into it, and it turned out that there were a number of states that were kind of on the way to adopting kind of more and more interior design regulation. ASID had a very, clever campaign of essentially sort of getting the regulatory camel's nose under the licensing tent. And it just became clear that this was probably the most aggressive effort that we had yet seen in any industry by essentially industry insiders using their political clout to try to enact occupational licensing so that only members of that insider organization, ASID, would be allowed to do interior designer works in those states where they were successful in getting licensing on the books. That is exactly the kind of thing that the Institute for Justice works to try to push back against. And so it was really right in our wheelhouse and my wheelhouse as a public interest lawyer.
So as you dive in, was this something that was commonly understood amongst interior designers? Did they know what was going on?
No, by and large, they did not. And there was, I would say there's sort of three buckets of interior designers. The biggest bucket was people who just had no idea that this was going on. They were shocked to find out that it was, frankly, any business of the government's, whether they practiced interior design or they didn't. The second bucket, the smallest bucket, I would say, were interior designers who were actually part of this effort to impose licensing, primarily members of ASID. And then the third bucket, and this was unfortunately about a medium-sized bucket, was people who basically understood that something was going on in this area, but had no idea what the status of licensing was, whether they were required to have certain credentials or not, what they were or were not permitted to do, and were just very confused and in many cases anxious about their status as, again, people who wanted to perform interior design work, but did not have any sort of official recognition from the government.
We've obviously talked a lot about the interior designer part of this, but also ASID allied members are being targeted as well. Members who had not taken the NCIDQ. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the interior design industry has this kind of what amounts to an entrance exam, pretty much like the bar exam for lawyers. The NCIDQ is a multi-day test that's very expensive. The last time I checked, it was at least $1,000 to take the exam. This was a prerequisite to both, not coincidentally, to both being a full ASID member and also eligibility for licensing in the small handful of states that required an interior design license. And this is a privately administered exam that's definitely putting money in some people's pockets. And it also serves an important, at least from the standpoint of ASID, gatekeeping function, so that if you can make it difficult to pass this test, which it is, you will artificially limit the number of people who are able to perform interior design services in a given state. And as a matter of basic economics, when the supply of something is artificially low, in this case, interior designers, then the cost of that good or service tends to rise. And of course, that's beneficial. If you're an interior designer, you're going to be able to charge more for your services if there are a smaller number of interior designers that have permission to work in that state.
So why are the bills written to confuse those in the trade and the public?
This is, in my opinion, one of the most insidious aspects of what I saw as part of the sort of the interior design licensing process. I'm a lawyer. I went to a good law school in the University of Texas. I graduated near the top of my class. I clerked for a federal judge. I've been in the game for a while. And I'll tell you what, I could not make heads or tails of these laws. Even the simplest and most straightforward one, which was Florida's, and it was neither simple nor straightforward. It was simply less confusing than Louisiana or Nevada. Very difficult to understand. I came to believe that this was done intentionally to essentially, I think here was the thought process. You write it in such a way that when you are lobbying to get the bill passed, you can tell legislators, oh, this really won't be that much of a change. It won't affect that many people. It's just, this is basically kind of, just an administrative fix. But then once the law is enacted and you create the actual interior design board that oversees the implementation of the law, and you fill that board up with ASID members, well, now the language of that statute is malleable enough that you can turn on a dime and say, oh, well, actually, this law covers nearly everything that an interior designer might do. And so don't you even think of doing anything that looks like interior design without becoming licensed, or we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. And this isn't theory. This isn't hypothesis on my part. This is what I actually saw happen time and time again. So I think this was by design, and I think it was quite insidious.
So recently, North Carolina passed SB 188. Does this type of regulation support all interior designers currently practicing, or those that are new to the field?
It's an interesting term you use there, support. I mean, the proponents of interior design laws will tend to try to portray them in a way that suggests that they provide some sort of a benefit or, support for interior designers. And I think it's more fair to say that they provide an advantage for some specially favored interior designers. That would be those who are eligible for registration under the law or who have been grandfathered in, which is quite common with these schemes. It's frankly somewhat difficult to know exactly what SB 188, which is now the law in North Carolina, does or doesn't do. But what we can be clear on, at least, is that it creates this status within North Carolina of registered interior designer, so that only people who have received certification can call themselves a registered interior designer. And my sense is that the law is probably best read to say that only registered interior designers are allowed to stamp and seal construction documents, although that is not explicitly spelled out in the law. That is, I think, the best reading of it by implication. So it certainly supports some people if you happen to be in that small class of people who are eligible for certification under the law. If you're not, then in my opinion, it really is more harmful than helpful.
ASID is pro-regulation. If an interior designer has not taken the NCIDQ, is it in their best interest to be an ASID member and support their agenda?
I mean, personally, I don't think so. I would put it this way. If you are very good at what you do, then you really shouldn't need any sort of official recognition, from the state to do that work. I can give you a couple of examples. For a period of time, one of the most prominent interior designers, here in Washington, D.C. was a former NFL football player who just decided he didn't want to play football anymore, but he was really good at certain aspects of interior design. So he started his own business, did very well. Again, at the time I was really heavily involved in this campaign. Juan Montoya from New York City was one of the most famous interior designers. He had no formal training that I was able to discern. He certainly wasn't licensed in any jurisdiction, but he was one of the handful of international superstars. So my sense is that interior design licensing benefits people who need that kind of supra or extra competitive advantage. In other words, they need the government to sandbag their competitors because they know they can't compete on the basis of talent alone. But my experience is that people who are really good, they don't need licensing, they don't need certification, they don't need the government to give them any kind of a helping hand. They're able to win that business the old-fashioned way, which is by being the best.
How does ASID benefit from the bills passed?
Well, the way ASID benefits from any of these bills is that anything that makes it relatively more difficult for ordinary people to just, kind of open their own interior design business, again, that limits the number of people who are able to work as interior designers. And some laws that we've seen, they don't actually limit who can practice interior design, but they limited who could use the term interior design. And so if you were practicing interior design in Texas, for example, in the early 2000s, it was perfectly legal for you to do that, but you were not allowed to call yourself an interior designer and you were not allowed to refer to your work as interior design. Well, guess what? That's going to make it harder for you to advertise. It's going to make it harder for you to use the kind of terminology on your website that people are looking for when they want to hire an interior designer. So there are all these different ways that the various kinds of ASIDs-backed legislation would make it relatively disadvantageous to non-ASID members and relatively advantageous to ASID members. And it all boils down to one thing, which is using the government to suppress competition and favor a particular kind of industry insider, namely members of ASID.
So ASID, it's not a blanket protection, correct?
Well, it depends what you mean by blanket protection. The legislation varies from state to state, and most states right now have no legislation. So simply being an ASID member certainly doesn't give you across the board sort of protection from competing with other interior designers or any other kind of protection. But in certain jurisdictions, it remains an advantage.
Does the State Board of Architecture and Interior Design determine who is eligible for grandfathering?
So grandfathering is a process that refers to when you essentially allow somebody to obtain licensure or certification, even though they don't themselves meet the requirements for that licensure or certification. So in other words, you haven't passed the NCIDQ, or you haven't had 2 or 4 years at a certified interior design school. So normally it's the statute. In other words, it is the law that was passed that determines whether people are eligible for grandfathering, and if so, on what terms. And one thing that we saw was that every interior design fight that I became involved with, there was always grandfathering. So they always allowed people who did not meet the qualifications to get in, but the window was usually about a year. So you had about a year to get in. And of course, they didn't publicize that. They just wanted, basically that little club of ASID members to know about grandfathering. And they had, again, 6 months to a year to essentially take advantage of that opportunity, after which time the window closed and there was no more grandfathering. And I think it was a rather obvious effort to circumvent or to make up for the fact that many of them did not actually possess the credentials that they then would turn around and claim are indispensable in order to be interior designers. It was a very revealing feature of these licensing laws.
You'd mentioned that the title interior designer had been regulated in Florida for a big period of time. Many interior designers had been targeted in the state without knowing that it had even been passed. And most were actually ASID allied members for over a decade. You were obviously instrumental in getting that law repealed. Why was the repeal of that law so important?
Well, look, Florida is one of the biggest interior design markets in the whole country. There's an amazing amount of opportunity in Florida, both on the residential and the commercial side. Florida had a somewhat unusual law in that it only restricted the practice of interior design in commercial spaces, but it prohibited the use of the terminology interior design or interior designer, regardless of whether you were working in a residential space or a commercial space. So to boil that down, in order to do commercial work, you had to have a license in Florida. You were allowed to do residential work without a license or any other recognition from the state, but you were not permitted to use the accurate terminology to describe what you were doing, which is interior design, even if you were doing it lawfully in a residential area. When we challenged that law, the first thing the state did was it in effect stipulated that the titling restriction on the residential side was indefensible and stipulated that they were not even going to try to defend that. So that got struck down immediately. Then the big fight was over the constitutionality of restricting the practice of interior design on the commercial side to people who had been licensed by the state. We unfortunately lost that fight in court, but about 10 years later, pretty recently, the licensing scheme for interior designers in Florida was repealed across the board. And so now anybody can be an interior designer in Florida, just like 48 other states.
With the popularity of so many Instagram designers and HGTV celebrities, is this still an issue that we should be concerned with?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, there is, once an industry has gotten a taste for anti-competitive legislation, and ASID is ravenous for anti-competitive licensing in the interior design field, you're never really safe because the advantages are tremendous. The idea that you can go to a state legislature, get a law passed, and suddenly you don't have to compete with 80 or 90% of people who might otherwise be in that business, some of whom are very talented, like we discussed before in the case of Juan Montoya and others. Kelly Weisler on the West Coast is another name that comes to mind. So the incentives will stay for ASID to continue pushing for this anti-competitive regulation. I think we can never be too vigilant, and I certainly would never take my eye off the ball. The moment you turn your back, you can expect ASID to be trying to get a licensing law passed in another jurisdiction.
As someone who's fought for equal rights and constitutional rights for various industries, how did the interior design industry stack up across those various industries?
Yeah, so I have pushed back against anti-competitive occupational licensing in more than a dozen different vocations, and I have to say the level of effort and the commitment to enacting anti-competitive licensing laws in the interior design field was stronger than anything I've ever seen. It was just an astonishingly strong effort on the part of ASID. They were relentless. I think to some extent, they've eased up. I haven't followed it in my new job. I have a lot of other things on my plate, but the amount of money that they were willing to spend and the effort that they would put into either getting a law passed to restrict the practice of interior design or preserving one and defending it after they had gotten it on the books were just off the charts.
When did you realize, Clark, that you were making a difference for interior designers?
Well, I mentioned earlier that ASID had this very clever kind of legislative strategy where they would sort of get the camel's nose under the tent. And the way they would do that was that instead of going for what we call a practice act, in other words, a law that restricts who can practice interior design, instead of going for that one right off the bat, they would go for what's called a titling law. So then they would instead of saying you have to have a license to practice interior design, the first step for ASID would be to get a law passed that says, well, you have to be certified by the state to call yourself an interior designer or to refer to the work that you do as interior design. Now, anybody can do it. You don't have to have a license from the state to do it, but if you want to use that terminology, you have to get certified by the state. And as I mentioned earlier, that was a rather obvious effort to do two things. First would be to prevent potential competitors from using the terminology that most accurately describes what they do, which makes it hard for them to advertise their services. And second, it establishes this kind of regulatory beachhead where ASID could come back a couple of years later and say to the legislature, well, as long as we're regulating the use of the term interior designer, we really ought to be regulating the practice of interior design as well. And when we realized that we were really beginning to sort of dig in and make a difference is when we began blowing up these titling acts, the ones that restricted who could use the terminology. Those are actually a much riper target in court for reasons that we could get into later, but they're just easier to challenge essentially because they're preventing people from using speech that accurately describes activity that they're lawfully engaged in. And courts will be very vigilant about anything having to do with speech. So we started blowing those up left and right. I think we took down at least 7 or 8 of those titling laws and really began gaining momentum. And that's when we then set our sights on Florida's Practice Act, which turned out, as you know, to be a tougher nut to crack, but ultimately it did unravel, and we're in a much better place today than we were 10 or 15 years ago when it comes to interior design licensing.
Do they push the laws through lobbyists? Many allied members in Florida weren't even aware of this agenda. How does it happen?
Oh, absolutely. They go out and hire lobbyists. They hired some of the best lobbyists in Florida to defend that law. I participated in legislative hearings in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania. I've seen their lobbyists right there in the chamber. I think one of the funniest ones was in Ohio. During a legislative hearing, somebody asked the sponsor of an interior design licensing bill a pretty straightforward question. He didn't know the answer. He literally just had to turn to the ASID lobbyist and say, well, you're going to have to ask him. This is his bill. The answer is yes, absolutely. Every cynical thing you've ever heard about lobbying or lobbyists was absolutely dead on accurate in terms of what ASID was doing. And I have no idea how much money they spent on lobbyists over the year, but I'm sure they put a lot of lobbyist kids through college.
How did you become aware of the Designer Society of America and begin a relationship with them?
Yeah, so the wonderful thing about working on this project in terms of pushing back against illegitimate interior design regulation is that there were a number of groups that were on what I consider to be the right side of the issue. In other words, they recognize that this is a job that anybody should have the ability to do and to succeed, according to their merits. If you're really good at this, then you should succeed, and you shouldn't have to pass some ridiculous exam or go to school for some number of years in order to be in the space. So the Interior Design Society of America, the NKIB, the National Kitchen and Bath Association, and a handful of other organizations ended up being wonderful partners in the effort to essentially say, look, the interior design field is a wonderfully creative and vibrant vocation, and there's no need for government regulation. And on the contrary, government regulation drives up cost, reduces consumer choice, and cuts off occupational opportunities to people who would have otherwise thrived in the industry. So it was a real pleasure to work with all of those groups.
Obviously, so much work has already been done and so much awareness has been created. How much further does this need to go?
Well, it's sort of a glass half full, glass half empty question, right? Because the ASID never really got a strong foothold on persuading legislatures to enact what I referred to earlier as practice acts, meaning laws that required an occupational license like what a lawyer or a doctor has to get in order to practice interior design. So they managed to do it in Florida, but only for commercial work. They managed to do it in Nevada and Louisiana. They tried very hard to do it in larger markets, New York, California, Texas, but we, along with others, were able to resist those efforts. And so I think in large measure, we can describe ASID's campaign for occupational licensing of interior designers to be a failure at this point. They really have only 2 states. Washington, D.C. Has a practice act as well, but when we did a records request a number of years ago and asked how many times the law has been enforced, their answer was 0. So apparently they make no effort to enforce the law in DC. So I don't know whether ASID, has a sort of a new campaign in mind, whether they'll try again. But I think it's fair to describe their overall effort, and they did try very hard to try to create a world in which interior designers had to be licensed to the same extent as doctors or lawyers. To the extent that was their goal, I think we can accurately describe the result as a complete failure or near complete failure. They've got some kind of a practice act in Louisiana and Nevada, but that's not much of a beachhead. I think they have. I think their plan for industry domination lies in tatters.
I'm guessing you've gotten to speak with so many interior designers. What has been the reaction to A, your work, and B, what they've learned about this process?
Well, I think the reaction has been almost uniformly favorable. Now, there's probably a selection mechanism there. I would guess that most of the people who support interior design licensing haven't exactly been seeking me out for a constructive conversation. I know they're out there, and I've certainly had some interaction with them. But by and large, I think that most people realize that, again, the key to being a successful interior designer is your talent and your dedication, your work ethic. It's funny, I met any number of state certified or state licensed interior designers who never even went to interior design school. They did not pass the NCIDQ. They never went to interior design school. They were grandfathered in. I actually got to question one of them in something called a deposition, which is like, where you get to question somebody under oath outside of a courtroom. She was the interior design industry representative to the Texas Architecture and Interior Design Board. She was one of the most successful interior designers in the state of Texas and specialized in healthcare facilities in South Texas. And she was absolutely dominant in that market and never even went to college, never studied interior design, but she was tremendously successful. And I asked her point blank, is the fact that you never took interior design classes or the fact that you never passed NCIDQ, has that prevented you from being, a great interior designer? And she said, no, absolutely not. And to me, that tells you the whole story right there. She had an aptitude, she had the work ethic, she had the drive. And at the end of the day, that's all it should take.
Is this a cause that you would want to revisit at some point? Obviously, you're now with the Cato Institute, but is this something that you do keep an eye on and think, if I have to jump back in, I'm going to jump back in?
I have enough on my plate right now, but I remain interested in occupational licensing. And I think if there were another concerted effort by ASID to try to impose interior design practice acts, licensing of interior design in order to do the work, I might well get interested again. I'm not in the same position that I was before, but I remain very interested in unnecessary and illegitimate barriers to people being able to work in the occupation of their choice and put food on their family's table. There should be a high bar before the government restricts people's ability to, sort of follow their dreams, live their American dream, put food on their family's table. Let's put it this way. We had it out 10 years ago, and ASID had an opportunity to make the case that it was important and necessary to license who practices interior design. They had the opportunity to make the case, they tried to make the case, and they failed to make the case. So if we need to go back and remind the country and legislators and judges and others that there is no really plausible case for licensing interior designers, I would say that you can pretty much count on me being there in some capacity.
That's a perfect end to this story. Clark Neily, you have been an unbelievable guest on DSA's Life by Design. Your work is unparalleled in helping interior designers. Thank you for joining us on the show.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much.